Every light in the banquet hall died in the exact same instant, like 1,000 candles snuffed by a single breath. Then came the wave of invisible pressure. Across the polished floor, 300 telepathic species collapsed in perfect, agonizing unison. Their minds were suddenly, violently blind. Corporal Vance Romer racked the slide of his combustion slug revolver. The greatest empire in the cosmos just lost its mind, and a baseline human is the only one holding a loaded gun. Subscribe to see how we fight in the dark. The grease smudging the glass face of his mechanical pocket chronometer stubbornly refused to wipe clean, an annoying detail he had noticed 3 days before the silence fell over Celestia Secundus. Romer polished the heavy brass casing against his uniform trousers. He was a token delegate, a diplomatic checkbox for the Stellar Coalition. Around him, the Ethelgard Palace hummed with the mental chatter of beings who had long ago outgrown spoken words. Captain Vornak of the Kalen Guard, a reptilian giant whose scaled crest scraped the archways, had made the hierarchy abundantly clear upon arrival. Humanity was present for optics. They were wrong. Beneath the floating gardens and light bridges of Celestia Secundus, the palace's true security relied on a forgotten mechanical foundation. Romer had spent his first 72 hours crawling through the sub-level maintenance tunnels. The Ethelgard security chiefs trusted their infallible telepathic network to detect hostile intent from orbit, leaving the physical tunnels completely abandoned. It was a catastrophic engineering blind spot. When a civilization relies entirely on a singular, frictionless system like a psionic network, they stop auditing the physical architecture supporting it. A crystalline power matrix doesn't harbor malicious thoughts. It just degrades under deliberate thermal stress until the microscopic molecular bonds snap. He found the microfractures on the 7th shield generator substation. The damage was precise, invisible to a telepath, obvious to a combat engineer, which meant the power grid was, no, it had to be a coordinated test. Someone was checking the cascade sequence. Romer filed a formal hazard report. An Ethelgard technician dismissed it remotely within 10 minutes, claiming human scanning equipment was too primitive to comprehend baseline crystal intolerances. They didn't even send a drone to look. So, Romer did what his species always did when faced with towering, immovable arrogance. He documented the serial numbers, loaded his kinetic weapon, and waited. And the waiting ended at the grand diplomatic banquet. 300 species filled the massive chamber beneath an artificial, rotating galaxy. The ambient psionic pressure in the room was a heavy, suffocating weight, a silent symphony of minds mingling. Duchess Illyria Solari drifted through the delegates, her silver skin radiating an inner, cold light. She had cornered Romer earlier near the appetizers, tilting her head with clinical curiosity. She was genuinely baffled by a species that still required kinetic weapons to fight and analog timepieces to track the day. To the Duchess, he was a fascinating, harmless artifact of evolution. Romer stood rigidly by the southern exit, doing his job. He counted the maintenance hatches. He mapped the blind spots. He watched the elegant, towering luminary float on magnetic fields, completely unaware that their levitation relied on the very grid Romer knew was compromised. Every elite guard in the room was relaxed, drinking, trusting a net that was already sliced open. When the people who rule the stars forget how to see with their own eyes, who do they turn to when the lights go out? The stillness before a storm is a universal constant. Romer recognized the atmospheric drop in his gut. The air suddenly tasted metallic. He slipped his hand into his coat, his fingers wrapping around the cold, heavy grip of his revolver. Romer moved away from the wall, his thumb resting on the revolver's hammer. The banquet was deafening. Luminary light pulses flashed in rhythm with Kalen throats singing, an overwhelming sensory display masking the fatal vulnerability beneath their feet. He tracked Baron Kale of House Vane, the Ethelgard noble whose shipping manifest Romer had spent all night cross-referencing. The Baron was hovering near the Empress, smiling thinly, his silver eyes completely devoid of the usual telepathic warmth that bound his species together. It was a predator's smile, confident and deeply insulated. Romer's earpiece crackled. Iris, his AI, fed him the telemetry from the sublevels. The power grid wasn't just fluctuating, it was actively rerouting to the psionic dampeners hidden in the ventilation shafts. The trap was springing. Romer pushed past a heavily armored Kyrox diplomat, calculating the distance to the emergency maintenance hatch hidden behind the kitchen corridors. He had precisely 12 seconds before the internal shields dropped. He drew a deep, steadying breath, locking his eyes on the Duchess, and broke into a sprint across the polished floor just as the artificial galaxy above them flickered. Then the lights died. The invisible pressure wave swept the Grand Hall, and 300 telepathic species collapsed. He shot the first shadow. The kinetic crack of the combustion slug revolver was deafening in the sudden, terrifying silence, shattering the insurgent's reinforced visor before the attacker could even raise his plasma rifle. Romer didn't stop moving. He grabbed Duchess Illyria by her arm, dragging her bewildered, stumbling form through the darkness and kicking open the maintenance hatch. Captain Vornak crashed in behind them, his massive reptilian frame trembling from the sudden sensory amputation. The galaxy's greatest warriors were completely helpless, like children locked in a dark room. In the pitch-black tunnel, Romer worked blindly by feel, tying a crude physical tourniquet over the alien royal's immaculate silk uniform to staunch the bleeding from a piece of kinetic shrapnel that had caught her shoulder during the breach. They had exactly 11 minutes before the dampeners locked them out of the mainframe permanently. Romer pulled 3 mechanical pocket chronometers from his vest, pressing them into the trembling, scaled hands of the Kalen and the silver palms of the Ethelgard, feeling the heavy, undeniable weight of history shifting as he ordered the most advanced beings in the known universe to synchronize their survival to the ticking of wound springs and brass gears. They split up. Romer and Illyria fought their way to the central core through blood and blinding noise, using primitive chemical flares to disorient the heavily armed guards. With insurgents swarming the catwalks, Romer took a grazing shot to the ribs, slammed his bleeding hand onto the manual override, and pulled the heavy iron lever exactly at the synchronized 0 hour. The grid roared to life. The transport ship broke atmosphere, leaving Celestia Secundus and its newly restored telepathic networks far behind. Romer sat alone in the quiet cabin, his ribs tightly bandaged. He pulled the mechanical pocket chronometer from his pocket, wiping a smudge of dry blood off the brass casing. It ticked steadily, no longer just a primitive tool, but the undisputed heartbeat of an empire. Will humanity survive its new seat at the table? We'll be here tomorrow with another transmission from the dark.